Well, welcome to episode 179 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about Joni Mitchell's 1968 debut album, Song to a Seagull, or at least in theory that's what it's called, but of course, famously, the artwork you can see here, which Joni had done on the cover, includes the title spelled out in seagulls, but the production team didn't realize this, and so what happens is it actually gets cut off. And so commonly this album is also known as just Joni Mitchell. This has been described as her least user-friendly album of her early records. She had written, at this point, quite a lot of hits for people, including people like Judy Collins, which have been quite successful. She herself was not that well known, and strangely, she chooses not to include any of these better-known songs on this record. It's also, in production terms, probably the most stripped down of all of her records, and this is a conscious choice made by Joni and her producer and then boyfriend, David Crosby, who wanted her to sound absolutely unfiltered, not overdubbed, not overproduced. Supposedly, these production choices and microphone placements led to a bunch of hiss in the original tapes, which had to be removed at the cost of some of the high end, which has some people on the internet wringing their hands. I think if you're a golden retriever, you'll probably be disappointed, but personally, I find it sounds just fine. So Joni, of course, is Canadian. She was born in Alberta in 1943 as Roberta Joan Anderson. Her dad at the time during the war is an RCAF flight instructor. He then becomes a grocer. They move around the prairies for quite some time until she's about 11, and then they settle in Saskatoon. Although she had some musical talent, her real interest growing up was not actually in music, it was actually in painting. And of course, famously, she does the cover art on most, if not all, of her records. When she was a kid, she had polio, which weakened her left hand, her fretting hand. And so when she played guitar, she had to do a number of adaptations, particularly in terms of the tunings that she used in order to give her left hand a bit of a break. And that, in turn, would end up influencing her songwriting significantly in the years to come. Her teen years are a little bit troubled. She ends up dropping out of high school. Eventually, she makes her way to Calgary, where she enrolls in art school in the winter of 1963-64. She drops out of that program as well in early 1964 and begins to focus on gigging, playing in and around Calgary coffeehouses, which of course is a bit of a limited scene. Late in that summer of 1964, pregnant, although she doesn't know it, she makes a decision to head to Toronto to go to the folk scene there, which was much bigger. She arrives that fall and initially, despite her talent, finds it very difficult to make headway in what was a very established scene, particularly as she was playing cover tunes. She then, of course, discovers that she's pregnant, and in February 1965, she gives birth to her daughter, who she gives up for an adoption, which, of course, is a terribly traumatic event, one which is not something one moves past maybe ever. It plays out in her songwriting, and she, in fact, says that this is the event that really kicks off her interest in songwriting because it's basically a significant piece of trauma and she has to express how she feels. Out of this unhappy event, some pretty amazing songs start to appear, and she starts to play her original material in and around Toronto. She gets a regular gig at the Penny Farthing, which is one of the folk clubs there, and there she meets a guy called Chuck Mitchell, who's also a folk singer, an American guy. They fall in love, and he says, let's go to the States, you can make your name there. And so they go and they get married, and they move to Detroit. And this all happens. Her baby's born in February 1965. They're married and living in Detroit by June 1965. So pretty telescoped. For a couple of years, Joni and Chuck gigged together and separately in and around Detroit. That relationship falls apart, and in the summer of 1967, she heads off to New York. From her base in New York, she gigs up and down the eastern seaboard through the summer of 1967. She's also writing her own songs, and she's discovered that year in two different ways. First through her songwriting, and then only secondarily through her performances. People in the folk scene began to hear her tunes and began to cover them. People like Buffy St. Marie, Dave Van Ronk, and most importantly, Judy Collins, who covered 3 Joni Mitchell tunes, all to great success, including, of course, the big hit Both Sides Now. So at this point, Joni is starting to make some headway as a songwriter, but she still hasn't been discovered as a performer until a gig that fall in Coconut Grove, Florida, where who should walk into the club but David Crosby. They fall for each other, and he persuades her that her future as a folk singer is not in small clubs in Florida, but actually out in the West Coast in Los Angeles. So out they go in the fall of 1967. Crosby, of course, was world famous at that point. He'd been in the Byrds, although he'd been kicked out, but he knew everybody in the LA music scene. He introduces Joni to all kinds of folks, and eventually that fall she gets signed to Reprise Records and goes into the studio with Crosby to make this album. The record is made at Sunset Sound in Los Angeles during the latter part of 1967 and the early part of 1968, and because of the deal that they had struck with Reprise Records, Crosby is the producer. It's basically just Joni on guitar or piano and, of course, vocals. She and a guy called Lee Kiefer share a little bit of time on a strange instrument called a banshee, which is kind of played up in the cover notes and in descriptions of the album, but doesn't really feature that much on the record, just on one song. The only other player on the record is Crosby's friend Stephen Stills, of course, with whom he'd go on to greater fame and fortune in later years, who was playing next door with Buffalo Springfield, and he comes in to play bass on one track. The record is very much a concept album. It's really about the last few years of Joni's life. It's themed in that one side is about the city, which is basically roughly about her time in New York, and the second side is about the country and the seaside, which is largely about her trip to LA. But of course, she had been married, divorced, moved countries, given up a child for adoption, all in the space of 3 years. And so she's got all kinds of material here. And so she's just overflowing with what would be quite remarkable, if not as finely crafted as they would be in the future, autobiographical songs. Fitting with this theme, side one isn't called side one, it's called I Came to the City. And it starts with the song I Had a King, which is a remarkable song. This is our first taste of the autobiographical delving into her own love life, which Joni would mine again and again and again in future years. If you want some version of immortality, get with Joni Mitchell for a while. This song in particular kind of gets into the nitty-gritty of her divorce from Chuck Mitchell, including the fact that when she left Detroit to go to New York, he changed the locks, and there's reference to that in there. This is a song where she uses most of her register, and the lower passages are really quite striking. Even though she's relatively inexperienced at this point, you can tell she's really the master of her instrument. The next song, Michael from Mountains, is about another flame, a guy that she knew for a little bit of time when she was in New York. That's followed by Night in the City, which is a song on which Stephen Stills guests on bass, and this actually really changes the texture and the feeling of the song. It stands out from all the other tracks on the record. Joni is double-tracked through most of the song, harmonizing and singing in the round with herself to really good effect. Next song, Marcy, isn't anything like as upbeat. It's much more melancholy is a word. It's kind of an Eleanor Rigby kind of song, like Eleanor Rigby in New York. The first side ends with Nathan Lafreniere, which is a song about a taxi driver with that name who gave her a ride to the airport one time. It's about Mitchell's anxiety about New York turning her into someone paranoid, someone burnt out, and so on. She's already kind of pining for a different environment, which of course she famously would find and settle into on the West Coast. This is the track, too, where the famous banshee appears, which really ends up being no more than kind of a feedback wail for a little bit of time. The second side is known as Out of the City and Down to the Seaside, and it starts with a track called Sister Belle Lane. Lyrically, this is about pastoral bliss in a country house in a country lane, but of course it's a little deeper than that. It's also a little bit about Joni taking shots at some of the fakers on the LA scene. The next song is The Dawn Treader, which of course is the title of a book by C.S. Lewis in the Narnia series, which is about a boat called the Dawn Treader, but that's not the boat in question. The boat in question is actually David Crosby's boat. Of course, Mitchell and Crosby were in a relationship, and the reason that David Crosby was actually in Florida when he discovered Joni Mitchell was that he was looking for a yacht. He got kicked out of the Byrds in the summer of '67, and he borrowed 25 grand from Peter Tork of the Monkees, and he went to look for a yacht, and he found that somebody had a yacht for his specifications in Florida. He eventually buys it. It's a 47-foot yacht called the Mayan, and he lived on it between 1968 and 1970, and he still has it today. Joni says it's the only actual love song in the album, and of course it's written about Crosby when he's infatuated with Joni, but also infatuated with this yacht. Ironically, of course, by the time the record comes out, they're basically already splitting up. The Pirates of Penance is probably the weirdest song in the album. It's obviously a play on Gilbert and Sullivan, and there are some vocal stylings which obviously very clearly reference that operetta style of singing. It's an interesting and complex song. It's got some unusual chord changes. If Kate Bush didn't take inspiration from this, I'd be really shocked. I don't know that I really like the song, but you can't help but be impressed by the mind that wrote it. The next song is Song to a Seagull, the title track, which is really about loving the freedom of all flying things. It's a very beautiful song, if having a bit of a distant feel, which I guess is kind of like Joni herself. My favorite track in the album, however, is the very last track, which is Cactus Tree. This is yet another autobiographical song about her love life. Crosby gets a whole verse. The guy who features in Michael from Mountains also gets a verse. Clearly, men were falling for Joni Mitchell all the time. She would never let them get too close, and the lyrics warn, basically, if you follow me, you'll lose me. At some level, this record is kind of about its stated concept, city versus country, but it's much more about the struggle of love versus freedom, which Mitchell was undergoing all the way through the previous years and through these different relationships, and of course, during the period where she gave her child up for adoption. She's already a strong singer, but she'd get a lot better at melody and song dynamics. At points, there's kind of a monotony which takes over, but I don't want to overplay that. It's a really strong debut with room for improvement. It's a must, I think, if you're a Joni fan, and I give it 4 to 5 stars.